We are happy to have with us Mr. Joseph Olassa, the CEO of Ignitho Technologies, a technology service company headquartered in the US.
Akshay Agarwal, and really appreciate all the kind words. So I feel really humbled to hear it, and I think it's still a journey. I think we're still at early stages of our growth, but I really appreciate all the words you said, and I hope we'll be able to live up to that, right? And before I start, I want to once again thank the World Trade Center, Vivek and team to invite us, and also the Indian Chamber of Commerce and Mr. Akshay Agarwal and team to have invited us. So I really appreciate that, right? So the way I've tried to structure this is that, there is two parts to how we will present it, right? And the way we have usually done it in Europe, where, there is, well-known innovation events, like one is, Frugal in Helsinki. We have, Frugal in UK, and we also have one planned in the US. Typically, the initial introduction to what really is frugal innovation is done by the folks who have written this book called Frugal Innovation. And then I present the second part about how have we taken that concept and brought it to the enterprise space using technology, because that's the background we have, right? So with that, let me just get started. So if I can have the next slide, please. So, like I said, the whole premise of the topic is frugal innovation, right? And you would see that this is the name of a book as well, published by The Economist, right? As you know, Economist is one of the well-known magazines, it brings a lot of thought leadership. And this book was written by two gentlemen, Naveer Ajju and Jaideep Prabhu. Both of them, when they wrote the book, were professors at the Cambridge University, right? As you know, Cambridge University is one of the top universities across all of Europe. And because both of them came from Indian roots, and that Navi came from having worked in the corporate world, was in the IT space, etc. They were, from the university, called by a lot of very large corporates to say that, hey, this is at least 10 years back, where you need to kind of give us some ideas on how do we kind of continue to innovate regularly, innovate fast, right? And that's where, they kind of started to look at the external world beyond even the Western world, which is the US and Europe, to say, okay, where are some examples we can see for innovation, right? So based on that, they have written this book. And, like Vivek mentioned, the very first book they wrote was called Jugaad. But then, because it's an Indian word, and because it was published by these professors at the Cambridge University, that book, while it had success, but, was really a bit confusing for especially the Western world. So then they made the second attempt, bringing all the feedbacks, learnings, and the second book that they wrote, which is called Frugal Innovation, which has been a very well read, very successful book. In fact, the revised version, the foreword was written by the CEO of Unilever at that point, right? And the way, like I said, this section for the next few slides is something either Jaideep or Navi would present, and then I would come in when the enterprise side or the technology side of the topic comes in, right? So in this presentation, I'm trying to kind of cover what typically Jaideep or Navi would have done. So I'm not sure how much I'll be able to do justice to the way they would have presented. But then there are one or two occasions where they were not present and I did the talking, right? So typically when you hear words like Jugaad, frugal innovation, right? There's a lot of, views on what really does this word mean, right? So the way they defined it was frugal innovation, in their mind, stands for the art of overcoming harsh constraints, not just constraints, really harsh constraints, and improvising. It's not like, you just had constraint and found a solution. You are over time improvising and getting to an effective solution. At the same time, you only have access to very limited resources, right? Now that's a lot of English there. So, simply put, they said, how do you do more with less, right? And it's a kind of a confusing or a contradictory statement, right? More is the opposite of less. So how do you really do more with less and do more and better is, I think, the concept they're trying to do. I'm trying to explain that, right? Can I have the next slide, please? Right. So, like I said, this is years of research they have done and written 2 books. So, it will be gross injustice to kind of say everything that they've written, encompasses in these 5 principles. But, and I would highly recommend that if time permits, please to read the book. The book is called Frugal Innovation, published by The Economist. But then to get us a high level view, there are typically about 5 things that they saw in people who can really innovate frugally or frugal innovators, right? So first thing I said, the whole concept is that there is a mindset to say I can actually do more with less, right? Just because I have limited access, I have harsh constraints, doesn't stop this kind of an innovator from trying to continue to innovate, right? The second is, like Mr. Akshay Agarwal said, especially in today's world, we no more have the luxury of making things complex and stretching it a lot. We really need to keep it simple, and there is already a category of people who continue to look at simple things and keep it as possible, right? The third element is that think and act with flexibility, right? So it's not about, okay, day one itself, I found out the solution. And if you remember the previous slide, I spoke saying that what are the, how to improvise on what you're doing. So you're not fixated on the solution from day one, right? And the third is, it's about, I think, a case of seeing the glass half empty or half full. Frugal innovators are people who are able to seek opportunity in adversity. And the word adversity is very important. A lot of us know that we seek for opportunity when there are some issues, but very few seek opportunity when there is an adversity, right? And last but not the least, these are people who really are doing it because they are passionate. They feel deeply about it, not just because, okay, I like innovation as a fancy word. I want to get into some, shiny object and do something about it, right? So those are, I think, 5 key elements they picked up about people who innovate frugally, or if there is a very simple light touch view of saying who is a frugal innovator. If you do these 5 things, you qualify, right? So I'll give you some examples, right? So if I can have the next slide, please. I'm sure the slide is kind of self-explanatory, and Akshay did also talk briefly about the space example between the space pen and the pencil. So this is a real-life example similar to that, wherein, in the Western world, when we hear innovation, right, a lot of R&D teams tend to kind of say, okay, I already have a fridge. Now, how do I innovate and then put a fancy screen on it? Can I bring a TV to it, etc.? So that is, the example you see on the left, right? At the same time, if you look on the right, this is a, small-time businessman who does some food trading. And he saw that, in his villages that he go about, there is a shortage of electricity, right? So, forget about attaching a TV to the fridge. You don't even have, the luxury of a regular fridge, right? So what, as Mansukh Bhai, as he's called, what he did was he created a contraption which is kind of serves the purpose of a fridge, but then it's built with clay and, naturally sourced elements. And the whole cost of this is, a fraction of what a fridge would cost. And you would keep the fruits cold without needing electricity, right? So, again, an example of what really a frugal innovator thought, right? Mansukh Bhai, as you would have seen, didn't have access to a fancy R&D lab. He was facing the harsh constraints of no electricity, no fancy equipment, etc. And how did he create something that had become a huge, influence and a huge support to his community, right? So that's one example. Moving on. So the next example is, many of you know Reuters, right? And this is also an Indian example. So I picked up all the Indian examples from Navi and Jaideep's thing because, he's in India now. So one of the issues, in the Indian farmers typically always faced was that, the amount of data they were able to get was always a problem, right? So, some of them may not have access to TV, some of them may not have access to internet, many of them may not have a smartphone, right? So so this was the kind of adversity or constraint that was out there, right? Now, if I can have the next slide, please. What Reuters achieved, taking a very frugal approach to it, was to say that yes, these farmers don't have access to a TV or a internet device, but most of them have mobile phones. They have access to simple SMS, right? So what they basically was able to do was, they said on a regular basis, or to all these farmers, they will publish these as simple SMS, right? So again, a great example of, frugal innovation. So because if you see in a typical innovation mindset, you would say that, okay, a farmer is not able to access to a lot of details. Let's create a fancy mobile app. Let's create, some sort of a, TV update to share it with them. But this is like, a simple SMS when farmer is at the, in his farmland trying to do something in his native language. When he gets the SMS, a lot of the key data is available to him, right? So that's a second example, right? Now let's move on. Now I want to really slightly move it to say that, okay, so the two examples I gave you was, in a socio-economic scenario, and there's enough and more examples there. But then because this topic is to then move into saying that, okay, is frugal innovation even relevant to corporates? Because the traditional thinking is that as corporates, we are all flush with cash. We don't have some of the constraints that, the socio-economic class have, right? So I'm trying to then give you two examples in the enterprise. Next slide, please. So this is the example, from GE. Many of you know GE. So they are a large, importing medical devices they make. On the left, what you see is, a device to help, premature babies that are born. So, it's a very expensive equipment, something like this you would see in a hospital in North America or in Europe, right? But then, the case of premature children is not unique to that world alone, but it is, across the world, and especially in developing countries, to have such fancy equipments may not be accessible to everyone, right? And that's where, the example on the right. So based on research and thinking from a frugal innovation standpoint, one of the things they saw was to keep a baby that's born premature. Basically it's about keeping the warmth of the baby, right? Because, that kind of ensures the survival rate much higher. And what they really did was, they went to, some of these spacecraft makers, spacesuit makers, and found some material that kind of keeps the body temperature the same throughout, right? And they designed this and developed it, and they have kind of been using it, especially in the developing world, especially in Africa as an example. And if you see the example on the left would maybe cost you millions to buy and use, compared to the example on the right would be a very cheap thing which kind of serves 80% of the purpose, right? Can I have the next slide, please? This is again another example in the enterprise world, wherein there are many cases of kids having ear infection, or kids having issues with the hearing, and if it's early detected, the chance of treating it is very high, right? Now many times when you take a kid to the hospital, they would get scared seeing a very fancy equipment, and sometimes you may not be able to get an appointment close enough to when the kid is already showing some irritation, right? So this is an example wherein this company in the California and the Silicon Valley, they developed a small addition to a smartphone, right? A very inexpensive device, which you could attach to your smartphone and then use it to detect this. Which again, if you see, a good example of frugal innovation in the enterprise, right? So let's now move on. Next slide, please. So, all along what I covered, like I said, the past few slides is what typically Navi or Jaideep would talk about, again, because they have researched this topic extensively, written these books, etc. They've been, they would very passionately talk about it. And then from here is when I typically take on. Now, I'll give a quick background of how we got involved with frugal innovation. So how did Ignitho and the co-founding team of Ignitho get involved, right? So like Akshay mentioned, we are a team of people who've been in the US, UK, helped our companies across Mindtree, Cognizant, Accenture, win multi-million deals, right? But then we very soon started to see that, a lot of large enterprises, especially the chief innovation officers and the CTOs with whom we work, they are saying that, as the digital world slowly starts to evolve, the board and the CEO starting us to say that, hey, you know what, I want to continue to innovate. There are these born digital companies out there. So there is anyway the classic example of Blockbuster and the Netflix example in the US. So there was a lot of push to say, how do you kind of become innovative, right? At the same time, the companies we used to work for was mostly interested in these larger deals, right? So, if you say, okay, let's do some innovation work together, some company has $50,000 or $100,000, our companies would be typically interested only, if there is at least a 1 million to a few million, visibility on the opportunity, right? And it's around that time then, some of us, had the connect with the university and the professors. And we kind of reached out to them to say that, hey, you know what, you are kind of saying that there is a way to innovate frugally. And do you see a way to kind of approach that, right? So then we started to work with Jaideep in particular and also with Navi. And then we started to identify a few, trends that was common to the corporate world or to enterprises, right? So if I may have the next slide, please. So one thing we figured out very quickly was that, this is even before we got started with Ignitho, is that, when you talk to the corporate world, it's never a case of, lack of ideas, right? If you talk around, not just your R&D department, if you talk across, multiple departments, you talk to even someone who's joined you, there is enough and more ideas floating around in the company. But then the issue has always been that, okay, how do you kind of bring together all these ideas and, nurture it to see, which are the ones that I can take forward, right? Which is, I think, then the next point, which is to say, how do I qualify an idea, right? So if somebody comes to me and says, okay, I am so and so in this company, I have this great idea. How do you then qualify it, right? And how do you create a business case? Because if there is, let's say, 100 ideas every month, how do I ensure that, I don't lose the good ideas and just, take the bad ideas because for the sake of it, right? And that's then the next point, which is to say that, how do I kind of figure out which are the good ideas? Because, everybody who brings an idea to the table thinks their idea is the best, right? So how do I as a corporate or as an enterprise figure that out, right? And last but not least, because this is, a collection of ideas, how do I kind of, decide which ones do I invest in? And if I invest, can I really put a small budget to get something out straight away, right? So that then was the next point, which to say that if you really look at the overall approach, what of them told us, no company really designates a very large budget to innovation, but then typically the expectation is that to innovate anything, you really need to have a lot of budget, right? So this is the context for the enterprise world, talking to the technology connects that we had, that we progressed with, right? Next slide, please. So, where Akshay spoke about how did we then structure ourselves is that we said, we will create a company, which is Ignitho, comes from the word igniting thought. We said, we will work with corporates to help them, progress some of these ideas into something that they can showcase, right? For example, I shared the example of what we did, what the Reuters example is there, of course, we didn't do it. But then can we, help them use technology to build something? But not the way of saying that, okay, to do anything in technology needs a very large budget, right? And then, we also created I.O.I.O, where we said, many times when we have worked with corporates in the last 3-4 years, we have seen that some of them come back and say, okay, this is what you have built together, there might be another company who might be interested in something like this, but we are not a software product company. Do you see a value in scaling it up as a standalone product? And that's where I.O.I.O comes in. So I.O.I.O is very much like Akshay said, the platform or this group company under which we are incubating and growing standalone product companies, right? And what I thought is, instead of explaining how we go about doing it, let me give you 3 examples of work we have done. So moving on to the next slide. So this example is, a case wherein we work with a large supply chain corporation in North America, right? Now, people are familiar with the corporate world, with how a lot of large IT companies approach, large, innovation and digital, etc. Typically it's about, okay, let's do digital transformation. And the word digital transformation by itself gives a feel that, okay, it's a large program, it's going to last for a few, years, at least 1-2 years, right? It needs to have a big budget commitment from day one, right? But then the way we have tried to approach, frugal innovation in the context with this company was, we said, okay, there are a lot of things you need to do to bring your business up to the digital world and try to be innovative across all the functions, right? So what we did was, I think this is an example I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, which is, if somebody were to give you a watermelon, right? The way you would eat it is not by just taking the whole thing and start to eat it, right? You would actually cut the watermelon into small pieces, eat one piece at a time, right? Similarly is the way we work with the supply chain corporation. When, we work with the CEO and the board, they said, there is, the entire people side of our thing where there is a lot of, noises and concerns and gaps. So the first of the, piece from the watermelon we took to help them with that digital journey, or help them approach it in a frugal innovation way, was to initially create something for the, employee management, right? And then, the next area around finance and accounting, then the next area around, logistics. So one by one, we started to approach it such a way that each piece of work we did was a standalone small innovation, which they could take to the client, take to their employees, get their interest, get them excited, and then add the next one, right? And the way we also approached it was that, everything we did was architected such a way that everything can be built and bolted on, so that it's not like we develop something which is for employee management. The next day you want to do something around logistics, then, you need to throw away what you did and create something new. So that is one example of how we have approached or helped a corporate approach, the world of digital and brought in the frugal innovation principles to this, right? Moving on. So this is an example of a work we did with a very large supermarket in Europe, right? Now, with them, what we felt was, while we see these fancy supermarkets, the nerve center of a lot of these supermarkets is their warehouse, right? So what goes into each of their supermarkets at what time, ensuring that all the shelves are stocked correctly. It's all kind of, based on what they do, what happens from the warehouse, right? And also, there is the angle of, the people who work between the warehouse and the supermarket. So, ensuring that whether it's at the warehouse or at the supermarket, lot of this, work actually gets done without disruption, right? So for this supermarket chain, there is a team of people who travel around. So they have about 300 of them across Europe. So they travel around, and because they travel alone, internally they are called as the lone workers, L-O-N-E, lone. So they are alone, so they're lone workers, right? Now, some of the issues they have faced, especially one particular example they gave us, was that in the, warehouse and especially in the supermarkets, there are these chill rooms where they stock, a lot of these frozen items, right? Now, in a warehouse, you can imagine that this cold storage would be very large in size, right? And somebody needs to go into, do their regular checking to see if everything is working correctly. And because, it's a chill room, you can't leave the door open. So once they go inside, they close the door, they are inside the chill room alone. And because it's, freezing temperature, the body, even with this, warmers, etc., can only last for so many minutes and that kind of a time frame, right? So there is a health hazard, and so many times, the lone worker who goes inside, they rush through the work to come out, because once you're inside the chill room locked in, if you faint or something, nobody will get to know, right? So what, the idea that the supermarket team had was saying that, how about we define, create some simple solution wherein, let's say on a mobile app or somewhere, we have a very light touch, mobile app or an SMS system so that when the lone worker gets into the chill room, they send a notification to say, I am entering so and so chill room, right? This is the so and so time. And if I don't come out within the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes, please raise an alarm. And then once they come out, if they come out within that 10, 15 minutes, once they come out, they come back and register on the SMS or on the mobile app to say, I'm out now, I'm safe, nobody needs to worry. And if within those 10, 15 minutes, nobody, gets a message, then, triggers go to say that so-and-so employee is in this room and they are not yet registered. Can somebody please go and check? Something is not there, right? Now, if you see, what we did was not really, very innovative, something very different. But what we were able to achieve was, a huge life-saving solution for this group of 300 employees for the supermarket, right? So one other example of how do you approach frugal innovation, right? So that's my second example. Now moving on, next slide, please. My third example is one of UK's largest airport, right? So, in Europe and as now in India as well, you would have seen that there is a large group of, low-cost airlines that are starting to operate, right? So one of the principles of a low-cost airline is that when it lands at an airport, it needs to quickly deboard the passengers and then, quickly get the next set of passengers and fly to the next destination, right? So for a low-cost airline, the every minute they can save in a turnaround solution is, huge saving for them, right? Now, there are already enough and more maintenance and repair solutions out there. But then what was lacking in the market at that point, which was a very simple thing, is many times, some of these airlines, when they come to the airport, because they coordinate with the airport for some of the repairs, many times it won't be a repair at a hangar. It might just be a light touch repair, some screw is loose or some light is not turning on. So the way they used to do was that they would actually, use their walkie-talkie to communicate with the service engineer. They would come back and then later they will scribble it all up and then go and put it onto the system, right? So the solution we then worked with the airport was to create a light touch mobile come web solution, which, they could, use to speed up the whole process, right? Again, another example of approaching it from a frugal innovation standpoint, not to say that, okay, to solve this, let's build a, completely new MRO solution. Let's completely change the process. Let's put, take a 1-year roadmap to how do we fundamentally redesign the business process, the business model, etc. It was a light touch, short, sharp work we have done, right? So that's my third example. So I think with that, hopefully you got a flavor of how do we as a company take the frugal innovation principles and approach it, apply it to our clients in the enterprise space using technology, right? Moving on to my next slide. So last but not the least, I want to finally leave it with you to say that, and especially like Akshay said, current times, even more needs something like frugal innovation. And even before this, frugal innovation has been happening. Frugal innovation is happening in the socio-economic world. Frugal innovation is happening in the corporate world, and frugal innovation is also, happening in the, technology world as well, right? And hopefully the stories I, shared about some of the early adopters should motivate you to also, apply these principles in your world. And finally, I invite all of you to, from today, try to do more with less. So on that note, I end my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for that interesting presentation on frugal innovation and illustrating to us with your real life experiences. Frugal innovation is more than a strategy, I believe. Maybe I can say it's a new frame of mind, new change, a changed outlook that we need to have. I don't think technically sophisticated products are any longer exciting the customers, but I think instead we need to strive to create good quality solutions that deliver the greatest value to our customers, definitely at the lowest. So as you rightly said, let us seek opportunity during our adversities and With that, let us open up for questions. I would request you to please unmute and you can introduce yourself and ask your question. You can also use the chat box that you have, where you have an option at the bottom right, where you have a button called the raise hand, so that we know that you want to ask a question, or you can just ping us on the chat box. So the floor is now open for questions. Yeah, we have a question from Mr. Rakesh Prasad. You may like to elaborate. So the question is to Joseph. You may like to elaborate on the recent innovations done in COVID times by small Indian companies.
Right. So, like I mentioned, my area of expertise and focus has been limited to the technology world, and we focus more into the Western market. So we typically work with clients in the US and UK. So my visibility or awareness is a lot more only into that space. Of course, I work with a lot of startups in India, but then specific to your knowledge to say, in the world of COVID, are there specific examples I can quote? I don't have any. But then, like Akshay mentioned, right, some of the things that we typically need to forcefully have a change of mindset, which is to say that there are harsh realities, we have limited resources, right? I think the COVID situation has created that situation by itself, right? So to now become a frugal innovator, that's your reality, right? So when you become a true frugal innovator is when you are anyway, facing harsh realities and you're facing, limited resources, right? And you need to kind of improvise because you can't really find the solution day one, right? And the examples I was giving was, typically when you try to look at innovation, you would say that, okay, for me to do something, I need this team, I need this lab, I need this material, I need this research. Then I'll, work on it for a few months together, and then I give some output, right? Compared to the way frugal innovator or innovation works is that you kind of start doing something on day one with your, limited resources and also, harsh reality. In our case, what you've done is because, many times the harsh reality was not there, we would artificially create it to say that, let's imagine that we need to do something in the next few weeks. What can we create? So I think that's the way we have approached it.
Yeah, thank you. Next, we have a question from, yeah, I think Rakesh Prasad has a second question. So how do you nurture your team members to think out of the box and provide frugal solutions? Any specific way of exposing them to diversity?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? So I think, and Vivek, you nailed it on its head when you said it's a change in mindset, right? So, if you hear the word R&D, right, research and development, the old world was about R&D meant, you have to take time, you have to have resources, you need to have a team. If somebody came and told you saying that, okay, let's do some R&D and come up with something tomorrow, right? Or within a week. The traditional thinking is to say you must be joking, right? Because, the underlying theme always is R&D means it's something that has to take time, right? You need to kind of do your research, you need to create some samples, test it, and then you will have a very long program of finally showing some results, right? The key to this is that change in mindset, right? The day you're able to change that mindset to say, it's almost like thinking with the end in mind, saying that, okay, what am I trying to achieve? If this is the solution I'm looking for, what is that I can create today? It may not be fully ready, but can I then take it to whoever is wanting to use it, try it out? I think, in the software world, we have what's called as an MVP or a minimum viable product, right? Can I take that, show it to the people who want to use it, and then progress from then on and there?
Yeah, thanks. The next question, next question is from Jay Kumar from Apollo Tires. So he's asking, Mr. Joseph, can you brief us on the ideation platform that you have in Ignitho and the process for qualifying frugal ideas from your team members and creating business cases?
Again, a great question, right? So the way we work with corporates is that we don't create that platform. We ask corporates or the company with whom we work to create that, because all said and done, we don't claim ourselves to be experts of their business. What we kind of tell them is that you create it, we will then work with you. So typically where we come in is, let's say as a company you have 10 or 20 ideas, right? And you decide saying that these four ones I want really progressive, right? Now, typical thinking is that these four ideas now need to have a very long process of getting from idea to a product, right? But then the frugal innovation approach is, okay, if you have four ideas or if you have 8 ideas, how do you pick them up and do something light touch, like minimal investment, minimal time spent to actually do something? Because many times an idea may look great on paper, but then only when you start to do something about it is when you're realizing that this is just not at all what we wanted to do.
Yeah. So next question is from Mr. Akshay Agarwal. So he is asking, what can offline businesses like traders innovate to come out of the current situation?
Right. So I think it's here, I would quote one of the examples Jaideep very proudly talk about, is that, in Africa, as many of us know, that, there are remote villages and access to electricity is a problem, right? So, and then at the same time, with all the movement of e-commerce, right? To get any payment done, the traditional online channels and all of that was not an option, right? So what, a company called M-Paisa was able to do was they kind of did two things. One is, they came up with a model wherein, figure out cheap mobile sets, not smartphones, mobile sets, which could actually be then charged once a month, right? And then they had a guy on a bicycle who would travel around these remote villages. And then when he reaches, he'll charge a small money to charge these, very cost-effective, cheap mobile phones, right? Then the next part of that thing was what they did is, you could actually transact your, payments using SMS, right? So if you see, they achieved 2-3 things at one go, right? One is remote village, which means, you can't really get internet and, get a smartphone. And, even if you get a smartphone and internet, the villages may not be able to afford it, right? So they actually, instead of innovating forward, innovated backward by saying that, hey, you know what, there is already enough and more very cheap mobile phones which can hold charge up to a few weeks, right? So then all you really need to do is once a month find somebody to go and charge these phones so that then they can last till the next charge, right? And then working within the harsh reality of a basic mobile phone, right, which doesn't have the ability to have a mobile app or a touch and all of that, they just kind of figured out a way to do the transaction using SMS, right? So I think, in current situations, the way I would think anyone who's doing business should approach it is to say the harsh realities of, a frugal innovator is forced upon us now. Everybody is facing these harsh realities. Everyone is faced with limited budgets. So I think what we need to do is, instead of waiting to get a perfect solution, how do we kind of create an improvised solution on an ongoing basis? So get a basic solution in, let's say, first few days, that's not ready, then create the next version and the next version and so on and so forth.
So I think next question is on ideation. So Ruben Roy has a question on what are the guidelines around dropping an idea?
Right. So I think, the way frugal innovators approach is, the way Jaideep would explain it is, the people who have traditionally been frugal innovators are not just looking for the next flashy idea, right? They do it because there is a burning need, right? Like the example I gave of Manshuk Bhai, right? He is not an innovator who's sitting every day and thinking to say, okay, what's the next flashy thing I can do? He had a burning need. He's a fruit trader who's taking it to the, villages to sell his fruit. And the guy who stocks his fruit is saying that, Manshuk Bhai, the fruit is getting rotten within the next 2 days. So, I can only stock so much fruits, right? So for Manshuk Bhai, it was a, matter of livelihood, right? So he was thinking, saying, okay, even if I can afford and buy some fridge to all these villagers, electricity is erratic, right? So I can't buy a fridge, right? So for him, there was a deep sense of purpose and a need to say that I have to somehow solve this, right? So it's not like one fine day he woke up and said, okay, let me just create this multi pool. He had a burning need which he tried to solve, right? So the way, frugal innovators always approach is not, okay, let me, start to figure out all those ideas out there. It's always the other way. They start with a burning need and they are kind of worried about it. And day one, they know that neither do they have the budgets or the, support system. So for example, for Manchu Pai, he is just a food seller after all, right? He has no clue how a refrigerator works. He has no access to a fancy R&D lab. But then he had that burning need, which helped him to think outside the box to create the material.
So next we have a question from Mr. Neelagandan. So he's asking, can you give a good example of frugal innovation in medical devices where field trials are critical?
So, I already spoke about two. One is, the GE example, wherein, traditional mindset has always been that if you need a baby incubator, it's a very expensive device which should, have all these bells and whistles, right? Compared to the example I gave about, how they created a simple baby warmer, right? It's like a sleeve into which, the baby is kept, which serves about 80% of the purpose, right? One other example I've seen Jaideep quote is, I think, about this eye care specialist. So he is based in Mumbai, and he's seen that there are a lot of people in remote villages, who have many of these eye problems, which if detected early can be treated very easily, right? So what he did was he worked with, I think, some of the local Indian entities and created a mobile van, right? And these mobile vans would travel to the remotest of areas, and then his assistants would be in these vehicles, and they would get the patients to come to the mobile vehicle, and then through a satellite link they'll speak to the doctor in Mumbai and treat them. So every day the doctor apparently keeps aside so many hours to do this on an ongoing basis, and they cover some 300 villages every year is what I've heard.
Thank you, Joseph. Now the first thing that comes to my mind when you hear about frugal is being cheap, in the sense the word cheap. So are all frugal innovations cost effective? What is your take on that?
Oh, very, very good question. In fact, one of the things we struggle a lot in the US and UK markets still recently, now with the COVID situation, that mindset is slightly changing, right? Especially in the Western world, the day you say frugal, it's always seen as cheap, right? So we have kind of, I think, worked with them to showcase that, frugal, in itself is not about the word frugal. And that's why I think, the word, which is how do you do more with less, right? So for example, if I had, let's say, 1 million budget to do R&D or innovation, right? How do you start to think saying, okay, let me just think instead of 1 million, I only have $500,000. Or let's say you have $100,000, instead of 100,000, you have only $50,000, right? So the way we've started to turn the whole thing around is to say that, how can you challenge yourself to do more with less, right? So, instead of, let's say, in your corporate setup, you are, let's say, heading R&D or innovation, and someone comes and says, okay, here is a budget, here is all the resources, can you do something meaningful? I think the natural tendency is to say, oh, that's too little, I need more budget, I need more people, I need more time. What we are trying to get people to think is saying that, can you proactively say, okay, I got so much of a budget, so much of a team strength, so much of a time frame, can I achieve results with much less of all of that? So that's the way, but I think, you're spot on in terms of saying that because the word frugal has a negative connotation on it being cheap, that's a perception we have to work with them. But I think today's world, I think it's a blessing in disguise, because today nobody says, oh, I'm flush with cash, so I don't want to do it frugally.
That's true. We can afford to say that now. So next we have a question from Ben Jose. So he has a question. How about frugal innovations for exhibition facilities? Please share your ideas.
Sure. So like I was mentioning earlier as well, I think frugal innovation is about some principles and common trends you have seen. It's not like these two professors from Cambridge University discovered frugal innovation, right? And I think Vivek, you also mentioned that, in India, for, years, there has been this usage of jugaad, right? So all the professors did was they studied a cross-section of frugal innovators and tried to get some trends, right? Because instead of saying that, okay, I think frugal innovation is a great idea and let me just go do it, what they have tried to do was to create a structure, right? For example, when I went for my MBA, I still remember being said saying that MBA is not going to really teach you anything new. All MBA will do is to tell you how is it done. There is a method to the madness, right? So similarly, frugal innovation is a methodology, right? So like, you have multiple methods for doing anything. To innovate, frugal innovation is a methodology to put it to any space. And that's why I said, there are enough and more people today who frugally innovate, in the, socio-economic world, right? There is enough and more people who are innovating in the corporate world. There are enough and more people innovating in the government. So for example, when we do our, innovation event every year, it's called, Frugal UK. We have a cross section of people from the government who kind of come and attend, and we have a particular slot in which we have people who kind of come and present, right? And I've also been very impressed or really motivated to do more by seeing that. So one particular example is that in UK and Europe, you have these very large trucks that go around supplying stuff, right? And to reduce weight, the way their the truck is covered is using a very thick, durable material. And I think in here we may call it tarpaulin something, right? Now that material, is much more durable than cloth, even better than some anything that we can use for rough stuff, right? So this entrepreneur, what he has done is he has bought all this used and thrown away material, and he's created carry bags for a lot of these government entities where they, when they travel to remote villages where they need something durable to take along with them.